Hi, class. So today we're going to talk more in detail about the League of Nations. So let's start with an overview of what this lesson is going to hit on, the three major points from it. So the League of Nations was established at the end of World War One. You should know that. It was an international peacekeeping organization. Even though U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was an enthusiastic supporter, a proponent of the League of Nations, the United States did not ever officially join the League of Nations because of opposition from isolationists in the U.S. Congress. The League of Nations also, it did effectively resolve some international conflicts, which I'll mention some examples of later, but it ultimately failed to prevent the outbreak of the Second World War. And I'm going to talk about why that was. So let's first recap the experience of the First World War. So World War One was, as you know, the most destructive conflict in human history up until that point. Right? We know World War II is going to be worse, but World War One until this point in history was the most destructive. It was largely fought in brutal trench warfare conditions. Millions of casualties were on all sides. Right? Millions of people were either wounded, killed, or missing. The industrial and technological sophistication of weapons created a deadly efficiency of mass slaughter throughout the war, right? Remember the new technologies that were created. It helped to make the war more destructive and deadly. Um, the nature of this war was different from previous wars as well. It was really one of attrition. Each side really attempted to wear the other down through a series of prolonged small scale attacks. And these battles often resulted in a stalemate where both sides really didn't gain any ground, but in the process, thousands of people had been killed. So even though the origins of this war were incredibly complex, which we've talked about those causes, and it's still like scholars still debate which factors were the most influential and important in starting the conflict. Um, the structure of the European alliance system, though, we know it played a significant role. This system had effectively divided Europe into two camps based on treaties that obligated the countries to go to war on behalf of their allies. Um, at the end, in the immediate aftermath of the war, American and European leaders they gathered in Paris at the Paris Peace Conference, right, to debate and to try to implement some far-reaching changes to, international affairs, to the pattern of international relations. They wanted to change how things were being done because they saw how horrible this war had been. They wanted to do things differently. So the League of Nations was seen really as the epitome of a new world order based on mutual cooperation, right? Working together, and the peaceful resolution of international conflicts. So let's talk about the establishment of the League of Nations. Also, we're going to talk about how it's structured as well. So remember, the Treaty of Versailles was negotiated at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, and it included an agreement, a covenant, establishing the League of Nations. And this organization, the League, first convened its very first council meeting on January 16th, 1920. So, really not long after the Paris Peace Conference took place. And you see here on the right, again, I've shown you this image. This is the Council of Four at the Paris Peace Conference, right? So remember, from left to right, you have David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. You have the Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and the U.S. President on the far right there, Woodrow Wilson, right? So let's talk about how this organization was structured. So it was composed of a General Assembly, and this General Assembly included delegations from all the member states, all the member nations, right? And so each member state was able to send representatives to this body, right? And they would meet together and debate and try to resolve issues. And so each member state got to send three representatives, and every nation had one vote in the General Assembly. And then you have the Permanent Secretariat, and they pretty much oversaw the administrative functions of the League of Nations, right? So basically, what they did was they would publish reports. They were kind of like experts in different areas of international relations, right? And so they would get together and take care of like the routine matters, right? So they looked at, political, financial, economics, transit, minorities, administration, mandates, like all these different spheres, right? They're all experts in these different areas. And they were responsible basically for preparing the agenda for the council, which I'll talk about in a second, and the General Assembly. And they also published reports of those meetings, and did things like that. Now, the Executive Council, I said I would talk about that in a second. Here I am. So, the Executive Council was this body that of which its membership was restricted to the great powers. So the council consisted of 4 permanent members, the quote unquote great powers, which were Great Britain, France, Japan, and Italy. And it also included 4 non-permanent members. And what this means is they were members of the League of Nations. They weren't one of those 4 though, right? It was other countries, but that they would take turns having those seats in the council, right? And so at its largest, the League of Nations was comprised of 58 member states, which is really not very many, which we'll talk about in a second, how that's a problem. The Soviet Union was one of them, so it could have been another great power. It joined in 1934, but it was expelled in 1939 for invading Finland. And that kind of goes with what I'm going to talk about next. What was required of those who were members of this league? So, members of the League of Nations were required to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all other nation states, right? So that's the reason why the Soviet Union was expelled, right? They did not respect the borders of Finland. They invaded Finland. So they were not respecting the territorial integrity of that country and were therefore expelled. Members of the League of Nations were also required to disavow, to condemn, right? To say that they will not use or threaten to use military force as a way to try to resolve international conflicts, right? Instead, they wanted them to use diplomacy, right? Talking it out. That's what diplomacy is. So the League really sought to peacefully resolve territorial disputes between its members, and in some cases, it was actually highly effective. For example, in 1926, the League negotiated a peaceful outcome to the conflict between Iraq and Turkey over the province of Mosul. And also in the early 1930s, it was able to successfully negotiate a resolution to a border dispute between Colombia and Peru, right? So it was successful sometimes. However, the League ultimately failed to prevent the Second World War, to prevent the outbreak of World War II. And it was therefore viewed by historians as largely weak, ineffective, and essentially a powerless organization. And the reasons why it was so weak is because there's several things, but the most important from in my opinion and from the research that I've done is it lacked effective enforcement mechanisms. This means they didn't have troops, right? They didn't have actual military forces, unlike the UN today, which I'll talk about later on in the lesson. But they didn't have any way to enforce their rulings, right? When they came up with a resolution, there was no way for the League to actually enforce it. Also, today we use things called sanctions, right? The UN uses them as well, and basically that means that nobody is allowed to trade goods with that other country, whatever country is in trouble, right? Whichever country is not listening and doing the right thing. The United States uses those. We've used them against Russia relatively recently, right? And so the League of Nations really it struggled to use those. It struggled to use sanctions, and clearly it was against the use of military force, and so it didn't have a standing army. And because of this, it really wasn't effective in enforcing its resolutions all the time. So some countries would just straight up ignore what it would say. Also, many countries refused to join the League of Nations, and because of that, because there weren't many many countries that joined, they were not bound to respect the rules of the League of Nations and the obligations of membership. Right? There are hundreds of countries out there, hundreds of nations, even today, right? And back then as well, and they didn't if they were not a part of the league, they didn't really have to listen, did they? Right? So because there weren't that many, that was automatically a weakness right there. This picture you see on the right here, this is the headquarters of the League of Nations, and it was named Palais Wilson, right? Palais Wilson, which is Wilson Palace in French, and it was named obviously after former President Woodrow Wilson, who was credited in the memorial that you see outside the building, and he was credited as the founder of the League of Nations. So let's talk about the U.S. and the League of Nations. So remember, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, when he gave his 14-point speech in January 1918, he laid out a comprehensive vision for the transformation of world politics. He believed that affairs between nations should be conducted in the open, they should be transparent, on the basis of sovereignty, self-determination, which was the idea that, all nations have the right to choose their own political identity, their own government, without external interference. And he also disavowed the use of military force to settle disputes, right? All things that you see in the League of Nations. So his vision, therefore, for the post-war world was obviously hugely influential in the founding of the League of Nations. So here you see this is from a British magazine, and it's satirizing Wilson's dreams, his grand dreams of world peace through the League of Nations. And you see in this cartoon, he holds out a very large olive branch, and it's marked League of Nations to a dove, right? And the dove is too small to grasp it, right? So it's kind of it's mocking, it's kind of satirizing his dream, his grand dreams of world peace, basically saying it's not very likely, right? The dove cannot grab onto it, and therefore it's probably not going to work. So they're kind of mocking him here. So his efforts, President Wilson's efforts, he really lobbied, and by lobbying I mean he literally tried to convince the Congress, right, to pass the Treaty of Versailles and to allow the United States to join, right? So basically, if you don't remember from any type of government classes that you've had in previous grades, I know 5th grade, 8th grade, you're supposed to learn a little bit about the structure of the Constitution. So the Senate is required to approve treaties, any type of treaties that the United States enters into. They have to approve it with, I believe it's a 2/3 majority vote. And so President Wilson, he really lobbied the U.S. Senate to try to pass the treaty. It was going to be a tough thing to do, and it ended up being a tough thing. He was met with firm opposition from isolationist members of Congress, especially Republican Senators William Borah and Henry Cabot Lodge. So Henry Cabot Lodge is the most important of those Republican senators. And he, along with the other isolationists, they objected to most vociferously, most, strongly to Article 10 of the League's covenant. And remember, Article 10 required all members of the League to assist any member threatened by external aggression. So, in effect, Article 10 would commit the United States to defending any member of the League of Nations in the event of an attack. And isolationists like Henry Cabot Lodge in the Congress, they were opposed to any further U.S. involvement in international conflicts. After everything that had happened in World War I, they were like, we're not doing that again. And they viewed Article 10 as a direct violation of U.S. sovereignty, right? Because the U.S. would have no choice but to defend those other nations. They were like, well, that's not okay. The United States, the people and the government of the United States, the Congress, they need to be able to debate those things, to debate declaration of war. We shouldn't be told by an outside force like the League of Nations that we have to go to war to protect another nation, right? So they viewed that as a violation of U.S. sovereignty, that Article 10. So as a result of this opposition, this strong opposition, the Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and therefore the United States never became a member of the League of Nations. And here is an image. This cartoon really implies that without America, the bridge would collapse, right? So this is called the gap in the bridge. And the bridge represents the League of Nations. And you can see Uncle Sam on the right there. He's the personification of America, and he's reluctant to place the keystone in the bridge to complete it. So you can see on the right here, he's leaning on the keystone, right? So he's refusing to place that keystone in the middle of the bridge right here. And um, this is odd because in the Treaty of Versailles, it was Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, that suggested that the League of Nations, he suggested it as part of his 14 points. So the missing keystone demonstrates how difficult it will be for the League of Nations to function without having the United States as a member. So it was remember, it was a Republican majority in Congress that blocked the United States' entry into the league, not President Wilson. So it's now known that Wilson was very, very ill during vital periods at Versailles at the Paris Peace Conference and afterwards. And he probably lacked, the will to try to win Congress around, right? He was very ill and sick, and it became harder and harder for him to lobby the Congress. And so it was ultimately blocked, right? So though the League had failed, to prevent the outbreak of another world war, it did continue to operate. It continued to exist until 1946. So if you don't know, World War II took place from 1939 to 1945. So if I tell you that the League of Nations operated until 1946, that means that the League was technically in existence throughout the entire World War II, right? Clearly, it wasn't effective, right? There was a major war going on. They were unable to prevent it from happening. Other member states left, and it became basically nothing. It was meaningless at a certain point. But it did continue to officially operate till 1946, when it was formally liquidated and dissolved. So by this time, by 1946, the Allied powers had already begun to discuss the creation of a new successor organization called the United Nations. And the United Nations, it still is in existence today, and it was based on many of the same principles as the League of Nations, but it was designed specifically to avoid the League of Nations' major weaknesses that I mentioned earlier. So today, the United Nations has a much stronger enforcement mechanism, including its own peacekeeping military forces. Like there are such things as UN troops, right? Also, the sanctions that the UN can pass are a lot stronger. And the reason for that is that the membership of the United Nations is substantially larger than that of the League of Nations, even at its peak. So today, the UN consists of 193 member states, almost 200 member states. That's about, four times larger, almost four times larger than the League of Nations was at its highest point. Remember, the League had about 58 member nations, whereas the UN, as you can see, is 193. So because of that, the UN is much more stronger. It's a lot stronger and more effective at preserving peace. It's not perfect, but it's better than the League of Nations was. So I want to know what you think, right? Why did the US refuse to join the League of Nations? Based off of what you learned, tell me in a sentence or two, why did the US refuse to join the League of Nations? And let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be sure to try to help you out.